I've always been a skeptic. As a journalist specializing in historical architecture, my relationship with the past was more aesthetic than spiritual. I admired stones worn by time, moldings corroded by sea air, the silent elegance of abandoned buildings, but I never believed in hauntings until I rented the old Hargrove house. Located on the western edge of Alders Hollow, a village choked by hills and mist deep in the Massachusetts interior, the house had sat empty for more than 30 years. The real estate agent seemed relieved when I signed the lease. "Just don't go into the basement," she said with a tight smile. That phrase stuck in my mind like a splinter. If this story already made you uncomfortable, maybe you should subscribe to the channel. Trust me, the next revelations are even more disturbing. From the beginning, something felt off. The trees around the property grew crooked, as if deliberately avoiding contact with the structure. The facade, tangled with dead ivy, looked like a forgotten face buried beneath overgrowth. And inside the house, the air, always cold, even at the height of summer. The first few nights, I blamed the sounds on the old wood, creaks, groans, the occasional sigh. But on the third night, I heard a rhythmic knock, 3 beats, a pause, then 3 more. It came from the basement. I ignored it, logged it in my notebook as structural noise, and tried to sleep. The next morning, I found a rocking chair gently spinning on the back porch. I hadn't placed it there. On the 4th floor, a converted attic with circular windows, I found a desk covered by a sheet. When I pulled it off, I saw something carved into the wood, 1813. The inscription looked crudely etched with a nail or blade, deep and jagged. I photographed it. It was only the beginning. As the days passed, curiosity overtook caution. I began exploring every room, noting architectural patterns, forgotten papers, unusual cracks. In the main hallway stood a stained glass panel, Gothic in style, that appeared to depict a ritual, 7 figures holding hands around a child beneath a waning moon. Something about the image disturbed me deeply, as if the figure's eyes moved with mine. In the dining room, I discovered a trap door hidden beneath the threadbare rug, locked. The padlock was rusted, but firm. I noted again in my journal, trapdoor, fine tools. From early research, I learned the house had belonged to the Hargrove family since the 19th century. The last official resident was Dr. Caleb Hargrove, a rural physician known for philanthropy, and for his abrupt disappearance in 1972. According to town records, he was never officially declared dead. On the office wall, a stain resembled the outline of a hand, subtle but undeniable. I touched it. The plaster felt weaker there, as if something behind it was pressing forward. The townspeople were friendly, but strangely evasive when I mentioned the address. "Oh, the Hargrove house. Still standing, huh? Or best to let the dead be," they'd say, always with a glance to the side. I began to suspect Alders Hollow held more secrets than it showed. On a visit to the local library, a squat building of darkened brick, I asked for historical town records. The librarian, an older woman named Clara, hesitated before handing me a dusty box. "These documents aren't requested much," she murmured. Inside, I found newspaper clippings, old maps, and a yellowed dossier bearing the Hargrove family crest. Several pages were torn out. One night, I awoke to a strange smell, iron and wet earth, the scent of damp basements or ancient graves. I followed the odor to the trapdoor. The padlock was open. That's when I realized this wasn't just a haunted house. It was something cultivated, preserved, like a cursed inheritance, a secret that demanded sacrifice to endure, and unknowingly, I was already part of it. The house was never meant to be rented. That was the first thing I noticed, not in the lease agreement, but in the way the town reacted when I told them where I'd be staying. People in Alders Hollow don't give warnings. They give silences, glances, deflections. At the coffee shop, the barista asked where I'd moved from, and when I mentioned 23 Dandelion Lane, he handed me the cup without another word. I arrived on the last Sunday of June with only 2 bags and a portable recorder. My plan was simple: spend 3 weeks cataloging the architecture, taking photos, and researching the Hargrove lineage for a long-form article on forgotten properties of New England. I had no intention of staying longer than necessary, but within hours of entering the house, I realized time moves differently there. Days stretch, nights collapse, dreams carry the weight of memory, though I know they're not mine. From the outside, the house resembled a forgotten museum, Victorian in structure, with turrets and iron latticework now strangled by vines. The front gate hung loose on one hinge, and every window seemed to have a different age, as if each had been replaced decades apart. As I crossed the threshold, the floor groaned beneath my boots in protest, not decay, but refusal. The front hallway smelled of varnish and mildew. Sunlight filtered through a stained glass panel above the door, casting a reddish hue across the parquet floor. The colors shifted as I walked, as if reacting to my presence. There was an unnatural geometry to the interior, doors that opened into narrow halls with impossible angles, staircases that sloped in slight but perceptible curves. I drew a basic floor plan on my notepad during the first hour. By the third hour, the lines no longer made sense. That evening, I chose the least dusty bedroom, on the second floor, east-facing. I laid out my things, set up the recorder, and tried to make peace with the place. But even in sleep, the house did not let me rest. I dreamt of corridors filled with whispering portraits, their faces blurring into waxen masks. When I awoke, my bed sheets had been turned down, hospital style, with a sprig of lavender laid gently on the pillow. I had not brought lavender. The next morning, I found the first hidden drawer. In the library, behind a column of rotted encyclopedias, one shelf slid forward to reveal a recess containing a folded sheet of paper, a letter, dated July 24th, 1928. We are not custodians, not truly. We are shepherds of memory. The hollow does not forget, and neither shall we. When the moon wanes and the gate opens, remember the 13th. No signature, no context, only a symbol drawn in the corner, an eye, closed, beneath a crescent. I began cataloging everything. Symbols, unusual objects, dates etched into the underside of furniture. The number 13 reappeared often. 13 books in the locked cabinet, 13 steps in the back staircase, 13 iron hooks in the cellar pantry. Even the old portrait above the fireplace, once faded beyond recognition, revealed 13 faint silhouettes in the background when viewed under infrared. And then there were the names, mostly illegible, scattered through marginalia in family Bibles, ledger books, and one cracked phonograph cylinder labeled Voices, Cycle 12. I had it cleaned and digitized. The recording is just static and murmurs, until the final few seconds, a woman's voice whispering, "He is the key. Thomas must descend." That name again, Thomas. I found it carved into the underside of a desk drawer in the study, and again scrawled in pencil on the back of a framed photo where the face had been burned away. At least 7 instances in total, possibly more. Midweek, I received a call from my editor. I lied, told him everything was fine, that the article was progressing, that I was still skeptical, but the house was wearing down my rationality. I had begun hearing things in the walls, knocking patterns, sighs, and a rhythmic chime I could never locate. On the 6th night, I counted it, 13 chimes, always at 1:13 a.m. I opened a section of the floor in the attic and discovered a metal box wrapped in waxed canvas. Inside, newspaper clippings, old coins, and a child's diary dated from the 1950s. The pages were yellowed but intact. The author was a girl named Eliza, no more than 10. Her entries were ordinary at first. School, her cat named Butterbean, a crush on a boy named Peter. Then, one dated October 13th, Mother said I should not look in the cellar anymore. I heard them again. They don't sound like us. One voice said my name, but it was wrong, like it was chewing the word. The following pages grew increasingly frantic. The last legible entry was dated November 1st. Uncle Thomas came. He smiled, but he's not real. I think he's part of the house now. I think I am too. After that, the writing becomes erratic. Scratches, symbols, ink blots. I haven't been able to read the final page yet. It smells faintly of smoke. I took the diary to the Alders Hollow Historical Society, a modest clapboard building wedged between a hardware store and a funeral parlor. The receptionist, a man named Arnold who looked like he'd been born with the town, refused to touch the book. "That family doesn't belong in records," he said. "They belong in the ground." I asked what he meant, and he only shook his head. "They had their cycle. You're not part of it. Best to leave before you are." Before I left, I asked about the architect, the original builder. He pulled a file, thin but ancient, and showed me a single blueprint. The name at the bottom read, T. Hargrove, Surveyor and Designate, dated 1879. Thomas again. I returned to the house determined to find the basement key. I broke open the desk in the study and found a hollow compartment beneath the drawer. Inside was a key with a braided red thread tied to it, and a folded parchment marked with the phrase, "Descend with reverence. Speak nothing until the 13th step." I haven't opened the basement door yet. I placed the key beside it this morning and waited. The house is quieter now, expectant. I'm beginning to understand. I wasn't the first to rent this place. I won't be the last. And if what I've read is true, I may not leave the same man I was when I arrived. The basement door creaked open on the morning of July 5th. I hadn't touched the key, hadn't inserted it into the lock, but when I descended to make coffee, it stood ajar, barely an inch, as if inviting me down. I stood before it for a long time, listening. Nothing came. No breeze, no smell, no whisper. only stillness, thick and expectant. I didn't go down that day. Instead, I returned to the attic where the air felt lighter, less intrusive. I'd started organizing the materials I'd found: letters, ledgers, photos, the diary of young Eliza. There were too many fragments to form a clear picture. Names repeated across generations, dates scrawled in the margins, and a pattern that refused to stay buried. Every 21 years, something was sealed or fed. It was in the attic that I found the photo album, tucked beneath a floorboard, wrapped in cloth, bound with black ribbon. The cover had no title, only the symbol again, the closed eye and crescent moon. I opened it cautiously. The first page held a family portrait, dated September 19, 1892. A formal composition, 5 adults, 2 children, seated stiffly in front of the fireplace that now cracked in my parlor. But their faces had been meticulously scratched out, not torn, not erased, but scored with a fine, sharp instrument, each one. All that remained were outlines of heads and shoulders, and the strange detail that they all appeared to be wearing the same pendant, a triangle enclosing the eye. Beneath the photo was a handwritten note: "We are 7. The cycle begins when the 8th arrives." I turned the page. More photos. Families, gatherings, even school classes, each face removed with surgical precision. One photo showed what I believed to be the living room in winter, with 13 children standing in a semicircle, hands clasped, heads bowed. The faces were untouched in this one, but their eyes had been blackened with ink. Who had done this, and why preserve the images at all? I flipped through the remaining pages, and one fell loose, a smaller photograph tucked between pages. It showed a man alone, bearded, with sunken eyes, standing before a bookcase. Unlike the others, his face was intact. On the back was written, "Thomas Hargrove, Cycle 5. The ink had faded, but the date read clearly, May 3rd, 1921. Cycle 5. How many had there been? That evening, I revisited the child's diary. I'd missed a page, one folded tightly and pressed flat against the binding. It was dated October 30th, 1955. The handwriting was shaky, as if written in a rush. "Mother won't wake up. The others won't speak." The door opened by itself. Thomas was there, not young anymore. He said I had the gift in my blood. He said I was the 13th, that number again. Later that night, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Slow, deliberate, too heavy to be imagination. I stood with my recorder in hand, waiting, breath held. They stopped outside my door. Then, nothing. In the morning, I found the study door closed. I always left it open. On the desk, my notebook had been turned to a blank page. In fresh ink, a line had been written: "You must understand the ledger to stop the seed." The handwriting didn't match mine. I checked my pens. The ink matched. Panic might have made me run, but curiosity rooted me to the spot. That's when I decided to explore the study further. I removed every book from the shelves, looking for hidden compartments, hollow backs, anything that would explain how the house seemed to be reconfiguring itself around me. And then, behind a warped volume titled "Hereditary Symbolism in New England Faiths," I found the journal. It was small, hand-bound, and wrapped in faded cloth marked with the Hargrove crest. Inside were the ramblings of what could only be called a believer, a zealot. The journal belonged to Dr. Caleb Hargrove, last official resident before the fire of 1974. October 12, 1968. The voices in the cellar are clearer. They speak in pairs. They ask for offerings. They remind me of what was done in the 5th cycle, the 7th and the 10th. I am not afraid. I was born knowing I would carry the 11th. Further entries described rituals, not metaphorical, not symbolic, involving blood, soil, and the alignment of lunar phases. November 13th. It is almost time. Eliza refuses to cooperate. She is strong, stubborn, but the gift must pass. If not her, it must be another. The house chooses. It always has. There were diagrams, floor plans of the house beneath the house, rooms I hadn't seen, symbols drawn beside staircases I hadn't noticed. The 13th step again, circled in red. I copied everything, scanned the pages, cross-referenced the dates. Patterns emerged: disappearances, fires, journalistic retractions, articles unpublished. I visited the local paper's archive. Several journalists had submitted pieces on the Hargrove estate. None were ever printed. One editor's name repeated across the decades: Mary Ann Langley. I tracked her down through public records. She was still alive, 92 years old, living in a care home in Essex County. When I called, the nurse said she didn't take visitors. I wrote a letter. She replied, "I remember the house. I remember the name. I knew Thomas. I knew what they did to preserve that bloodline. You won't find justice in Alder's Hollow, only memory." and memory always demands payment. That night, I saw the portrait shift, the one above the fireplace. The background, where 13 figures once stood, now held 14. One of them looked like me. The following morning, I noticed the clock in the dining room had begun ticking again, even though it had no mechanism inside. It struck once every hour. I watched it. On the 13th strike, the lights dimmed, and for a brief second, I saw a shadow pass across the stained glass window in the hallway. Not outside, on the inside. I checked the camera I had placed there. It had recorded nothing. Desperate for some anchor in reality, I drove to the county registrar's office and searched for death certificates related to the Hargrove family. There were dozens of entries spanning a century, but several names appeared to have no recorded deaths, including Eliza Hargrove. She was listed as missing in 1956. No follow-up, no inquiry, no headlines. Even more troubling was a line I found in a private investigator's report from 1977, buried in the appendix of a court case involving the house's ownership. Recommendation: no further inquiry. Town council strongly discourages reopening of Hollow Trust records. Archives sealed under Clause 13X. Local authorities complicit in suppression. Clause 13X. Another variation of the same cursed number. I left the office shaken. I couldn't deny it any longer. Alders Hollow was not simply unaware of the Hargrove cycle. It was part of it, and I had entered not as a tenant, but as a candidate. The cellar door remains open. I hear the whispering now, clearly, even in daylight. They are calling by name. Not Eliza, not Caleb, not even Thomas. They're calling mine. Alders Hollow was not simply silent, it was silenced. That was the realization that kept me up night after night as I sifted through the fragments of truth buried under layers of municipal cooperation and generational complicity. I had come to the house believing it was just another relic, a ruin with history. But now, I understood. The history was alive, pulsing beneath every floorboard, and the town had kept it alive. I began to organize my notes like a case file. I drew up a timeline, piecing together names, dates, events. Every 21 years. A new Thomas, a new incident, a new disappearance. The council archives were either redacted or altered. Publicly accessible materials all stopped at the same moment, late autumn 1974. After that, it was as if the Hargrove family, and the very notion of Dandelion Lane, had never existed. To find what was missing, I had to search where no one wanted me to go, the homes of those who remembered. My first visit was uninvited. Arnold Bellman, retired postmaster and lifelong resident, had been mentioned in a side note of an unpublished report written by Mary Ann Langley. Witness to the fire of '74, refused to testify. He lived on Pine Hollow Road in a two-story home surrounded by wind chimes and garden gnomes. When I introduced myself, he nearly slammed the door, but I held up a photocopy of the unpublished Langley report. He paused. "I didn't write that," he said, "but you were there." He stared at me for a long time, jaw tight. I was a child, 12. I saw the flames, sure, but I didn't see what started it. "Did you see what came out of the house?" Silence. Then, no one came out. That was the problem. He invited me in. The interior of his house was modest, cluttered, shelves filled with trinkets and figurines. But on the mantel above the fireplace was a framed photograph, one I recognized instantly. It was from the Hargrove album, a portrait of the town's founding families at a summer gathering. Their faces had not been scratched out in this version. "Where did you get this?" I asked. "My grandfather took it. He worked for the Hargroves. Stonemason, built the second foundation." "Second?" He nodded. "The one beneath the real one." He explained what had long been whispered, that the Hargrove estate had a sub-foundation, a chamber sealed in the early 1900s, not for structural reasons, but ritualistic ones. The blueprints had been passed between builders like folklore, hidden from permits, never inspected. "They said it was a prayer chamber," Arnold said, "but no one prayed down there. They performed." "What kind of performances?" He hesitated. "I heard screaming," he whispered, "when the moon was gone, and always after someone in town got rich, or healed, or rose in politics. That house gave things. It gave them, in return. Return for what? Children, blood, silence. I left his home, shaken, not because of what he said, but because I believed him. That week, I conducted 8 more interviews. Some were reluctant, others whispered, one cried the entire time. Most had lived through at least one cycle. A few had even participated. A woman named Lillian Graves, now in her 80s, confessed to lighting the candles for the 1952 offering. "They told me it was symbolic," she said, "but when I saw the child in the circle, I knew. We were binding something, not releasing it." She showed me a photograph she kept hidden in the lining of an old sewing box. a child with a stitched robe, standing in a chalk circle beneath the attic's stained glass window. His eyes were blackened with soot, not ink. "I never forgave myself," she said. But my husband walked again. After 5 years in a wheelchair, he stood up the next morning. The pattern was undeniable. One sacrifice, one miracle, over and over again. And always, the council protected it. I returned to the Gazette, confronted Harold Dunn with the letter from Langley, the testimonies, the altered death records. He didn't deny it. "You think this place survives on tourism and antique shops?" he asked. "You think the blight never touched us because we were lucky? We paid, quietly, deeply. And you," he pointed at me, "you're not the first outsider to try and unravel it. You just got further. What happened to the others?" He didn't answer. That evening, I found a package on the Hargrove doorstep. No return address. Inside, a bundle of documents tied with red string and a cassette tape labeled Meeting 13th Cycle. I played the tape. It was a recording of the council's secret gathering, dated just 3 years prior. Voices I recognized. Clara, Harold, Everett. They discussed the next offering, discussed the need for secrecy, the rotation of keepers, and the necessity of maintaining the illusion of normalcy in town records. Then one voice, a new one, spoke. "The 13th cycle completes the first full passage. After this, no more offerings will be required. But the gate must be opened fully. The host must remain." Another voice asked, "And if he resists?" The answer chilled me. "He won't. The house will prepare him." I rewound the tape, played it again. "They were talking about me," I whispered. I spent that night rechecking the attic, the portraits, the steps, the hollow beneath the staircase. Every floorboard seemed to breathe. Every corner watched. I found a page from Eliza's diary I hadn't noticed before. Tucked behind the lining of the wardrobe, the entry read, "He thinks he's in control, but the house remembers. It remembers every footstep, every cut, every secret, and it never forgets the 13th. I had to get out, but the car wouldn't start. The keys wouldn't turn, and every road out of Alder's Hollow led back to Dandelion Lane. The basement was no longer a room. It had become a descent into architecture not built but grown, shaped by will and memory. The steps felt like vertebrae. With every footfall I took after midnight on July 13th, the air thickened, the walls narrowed. I had the key in my pocket, though I no longer needed it. The door was always open now, just wide enough for one man to pass, or be pulled through. I carried with me a lantern, a recorder, and the journal I had assembled with notes, drawings, and testimonies. I thought I was documenting, but I was being inducted. The first chamber, which I had glimpsed days before, was now transformed. The dirt floor had been swept clean, revealing the stone beneath. Carved concentric rings etched with repeated words in Latin, Greek, and a language I could not identify. The phrase that appeared again and again, "Memoria vincit," memory conquers. 7 pillars rose from the floor, each adorned with relics, jawbones, candle stubs, dried hands. I approached the nearest and saw my own handwriting carved into the base. I had never touched it before. In the center of the room was a metal grate, circular, inscribed, sealed with iron bolts. From it rose heat and a distant sound, not fire, not wind, something like breath, slow, endless, subterranean. I moved on. The second chamber was worse. It was cold, impossibly so. Chains hung from the ceiling, ending in rusted hooks. Along the walls, niches held mummified remains in seated positions, each one blindfolded with black cloth. I counted 13. All wore pendants shaped like the eye enclosed in a triangle. One figure was different, larger, robed, slumped in a throne of wood and bone. As I approached, its head lifted, not fully, but enough for me to see the face beneath. It was Thomas, not young, not old, not alive exactly. His mouth opened and, in a dry, rasping voice, he spoke. "You're early." I froze. "You've been here. How long?" "I am always here," he said. "I am the hinge." I didn't understand. "You call it a house. We called it the anchor. Before us, others called it the remembering. Every generation one must be chosen to remember what came before the stones. Otherwise, the gate forgets why it must remain closed." He rose with an unnatural movement, as though bones bent the wrong way. "The 13th cycle is the final remembering. You are the seal." I tried to step back. He raised a hand. Around me, the 13 blindfolded corpses began to sway, as if rocked by wind I could not feel. A humming sound filled the chamber, vibrating the walls, pressing against my ribs. "You've seen the ledger. You've walked the dream. You've heard the chant. That is enough." "I didn't agree to anything," I said, trembling. "You stayed, That is the agreement. He led me into the third chamber. Here, the ceiling vanished. A dome of dark sky revealed a false moon, a projection that hung low and red. The floor was tiled with human teeth, arranged in spirals. At the center, a pit descended into blackness, with stairs carved into the walls, spiraling down. At the edge of the pit stood 13 figures in robes, faceless, breathless, motionless. Each held an object, a page, a lock of hair, a bone, a piece of fabric, a vial, a tooth, a ring, a coin, a bell, a mirror, a mask, a stone, and a book. The last figure held a candle and lit it. The flame caught, not just on the wick, but in the air itself. The pit ignited in blue fire, and in that fire I saw the first stewards, the Hollowborn not as a village, but as a barricade against the forgotten, a settlement raised on soil that pulsed with memory. I saw rituals that stitched together time, weaving one century into the next, and I saw what waited on the other side of the gate, not a creature, not a god, but a void of hunger that had learned to shape memory like clay, feeding on trauma, devouring history, wearing the faces of those we tried to forget. Thomas spoke beside me. We are not cultists. We are janitors of chronology. And now, you clean. He handed me the book. It opened and the pages turned, blank, then filled, then blank again. Images of the townspeople, their secrets, their bargains. Marianne Langley lighting a candle in 1974. Clara Haythorne burying a box of bones behind the library. Harold Dunn accepting a name from a child and scratching it off a list. Everett Langley kneeling in the sanctuary, sobbing. And me, standing in the attic months ago, placing my hand on the closed eye etched into the wood, a gesture I didn't remember making. You remembered before you arrived, Thomas said. The house only called you back. The fire flared higher. The robed figures turned inward. The chanting began. Cycle complete. Memory sealed. Gate closed. Host bound. I dropped the book. It did not fall. It hovered, pages turning of their own will. Then the pit roared, and from it rose a shape, not visible, not nameable, not human. A shifting wound in space, opening wide like an eye. And it saw me. I screamed, or I tried to. My voice vanished. I felt myself unravel, not in body, but in memory. Moments from my life slipped away, burned like paper in wind. My first kiss, gone. My childhood home, gone. My father's face, gone. And in their place, images of every sacrifice, every ritual, every unspoken bargain. I became the ledger. When I awoke, I was outside the house. Sunlight, birds, silence. The house behind me stood still, whole, quiet. I knocked on the door. No answer. I tried the knob. It was locked. No key. I walked into town. People waved, smiled. Harold handed me a newspaper. No headline, no date, just one line. The gate is closed. We thank the host. I looked in the mirror of the bakery window. I saw Thomas, and I smiled. I don't remember the exact moment I left Alders Hollow. There are gaps in my recollection, spaces where time should have been. I woke up 213 miles away, in a motel off Route 70, with blood beneath my fingernails, my recorder destroyed, and my notes missing. But I didn't need them. I remembered everything. Not just what I had witnessed, but what came before me. The memories of those sacrificed, those chosen, those silenced. Their voices filled me like marrow in my bones. I had become, as Thomas said, the vault. For 72 hours I didn't eat. I just wrote. I filled 36 notebooks. Every diagram, chant, list, ritual, council meeting. I transcribed the sound of the underground wind. I drew the sigils I saw burning behind my eyelids when I closed them. I detailed the final descent, the 13 chambers, the figures, the fire, the vault, the final chant. I wasn't just remembering for myself, I was remembering for all of them. On the fourth day, I re-entered the world. I logged back online. I started with anonymous uploads, scans of the pages from the ledger, photographs of the council's meeting room, even the tape I had found labeled 13th Cycle. The moment Thomas called me the Seal became a clip shared across forums with captions like Ritual Found Footage and True Horror or Hoax. At first, it was the fringe communities that paid attention, urban explorers, conspiracy theorists, folklorists, but then came the academics. One professor of comparative theology published a 26-page analysis arguing that the Hargrove cycle mirrored long-lost Babylonian lunar rituals. A team of historians cross-referenced names from my documents with vanished colonies dating back to 1658. The fire had spread, but not everyone was pleased. Within 2 weeks, I received 3 cease and desist letters. one from a Boston law firm representing the Alders Hollow Preservation Committee, one from the town's mayor, and the last one was unsigned. It contained no legal language, only a typed line. You were meant to remember, not to reveal. The gate was sealed. Do not open it again. I ignored them all. The emails began pouring in. Survivors, former residents, descendants of those buried by the silence. A woman named Ruth, 73 years old, said her brother disappeared during the 1995 cycle. A man from North Carolina claimed his great-grandfather had been the first architect to draft the 13-chamber plan in 1871, and that he too had vanished before construction completed. More damning still, a woman sent me a black-and-white photograph showing 13 children lined up in front of the sanctuary altar, eyes blacked out with soot, names carved into the wall behind them. One name was mine, but the photo was dated 1929. When I showed it to a forensic analyst, they confirmed it had not been digitally manipulated. I began collecting the testimonies, 74 in total. I published them anonymously. Each told a version of the same truth. Disappearances never investigated, fires never explained, wealth granted mysteriously after tragedy, memories tampered with. The stories varied in detail, but the pattern remained exact. Every 21 years, the town prospered, and someone vanished, and always a Thomas. A week later, someone leaked council minutes from 1974. An emergency meeting called hours after the fire. The language was sterile, bureaucratic, resolved. The cycle completes with containment. The vault is sealed. The asset remains functional. The asset, I realized, was Thomas, and I had become its inheritor. A reporter from a Boston podcast picked up the story, then a documentary channel, then a cable news segment. But every time the footage neared anything resembling the truth, the rituals, the chamber, the house's disappearance, the segment was pulled. Legal threats, technical failures. One episode was replaced live with a rerun from 1987. It wasn't just a cover-up, it was something worse. The town had power, not legal, not financial, something older. The people who tried to help me began to suffer. One researcher's house burned down under unexplained conditions. A graduate student who had assisted with my uploads vanished during a hiking trip. Even I began to notice shadows that followed me longer than they should. Streetlights that flickered only when I passed. That's when I knew. I had to return. I had to end it. Not by revealing, by destroying. On October 13th, exactly 3 months after my descent, I drove to Alders Hollow. No one stopped me at the town border. No one questioned the jerry cans of gasoline in my trunk. The town was too quiet, as if holding its breath. The house stood as I left it, whole, still, watching. I stepped inside. The first floor was empty. Dust had returned. The mirror above the fireplace had cracked down the center, the break shaped like an eye. The basement door was wide open, the 13 steps flickering with light that wasn't there. I poured the gasoline across every floor, every door frame, every portrait, every step. When I reached the final chamber, I lit the flare. The fire caught instantly, blue and white, roaring upward like wind. But it didn't destroy the house. It consumed the memory. I saw faces vanish from portraits. I heard names burn from ledgers. I felt the vault crack open inside my mind, and something slipped out. A scream, not of pain, but of release. The house collapsed in silence. In the morning, there was no ash, no wreckage, only soil, and a stone, one stone, with one word carved into it, remembered. The town never rebuilt. Within 3 months, Alders Hollow was declared unincorporated territory. The population moved. Streets were left to rot. Signs were taken down. I drove through it once, a year later. Where the house once stood, wildflowers bloomed in perfect circles. But at night I still hear them. The chant, the wind, and Thomas, whispering from the vault of my mind. I didn't leave Alders Hollow in any ordinary way. There was no exit sign, no packed suitcase, no clear path from the basement back into the world. One morning, I simply opened my eyes in a roadside motel more than 200 miles away. My hands were raw, as if I had clawed through soil. My nails were caked in black grit. My recorder was broken. My notebooks were missing, and yet everything remained inside me. Not just memories, impressions, layers of memory, lived and relived by generations that had come before. I remembered births I had never witnessed, prayers I had never spoken, the warmth of ritual fire on my cheeks, even though I had never lit the match. I remembered screams muffled behind stone, and the feeling of being watched through walls that pulsed like lungs. I wrote for 3 days straight. I filled notebook after notebook with maps, diagrams, chants, names, and dates. I drew the chambers from memory, each detail more precise than the last. The curve of the stone, the way the symbols bled light when spoken aloud. I wrote down the final words I had heard in the pit, the chant that had wrapped itself around my spine. I recorded the moment Thomas turned to me and said, "You are the seal," with a clarity that made my skin crawl. Then I sent it all out, not to major news outlets. They would never touch something like this. I started small. Obscure forums, folklore researchers, anonymous email chains. I sent scans of the ledger pages, photos I had snapped of the walls and symbols, audio fragments of the council's secret meetings. I uploaded the fragment of Thomas's voice I had captured just before the fire, and I waited. At first there was silence, then came the noise. People began to write back. Some claimed it was the most elaborate hoax they'd ever seen. But others, people I had never met, described dreams they had kept secret all their lives. A woman from Maine said she had woken every 13 years to the sound of soil breathing under her bed. A man in Quebec sent me a drawing of the eye enclosed in a triangle. He had no idea what it meant, only that he had been sketching it since childhood. It spread fast. Videos surfaced, grainy images of symbols etched in abandoned buildings, audio clips of chants matching the cadence I had recorded. A school teacher from Vermont posted an old class photo where every child had the same name written on their collar, Thomas. An archaeologist in Hungary emailed me a diagram of a subterranean chamber unearthed beneath a 17th century monastery. 13 steps, 13 robes, one missing occupant, and suddenly, Alder's Hollow could no longer be dismissed as folklore. I had ignited something, not a revelation, a reckoning. 2 weeks later, a private investigative team tried to re-enter the land where the Hargrove house had once stood. They found nothing but a field, untouched, no burn marks, no foundation. The trees around the site had grown in a perfect circle, but their drones malfunctioned. Their GPS coordinates spiraled into loops. One of the investigators refused to speak after returning. He sat in silence, clutching a stone with the word "remembered" carved into it. It wasn't just a house that had vanished. It was something older, something buried, something that didn't want to be unearthed. Then came the letters. First, a formal cease and desist from what remained of the Alder's Hollow Preservation Committee. Then another envelope, unmarked, containing a single phrase typed in bold, "You were spared. Do not tempt the gate to open again." I didn't stop. I sent the full compiled archive to a journalist I trusted. She read every page. She flew to the nearest airport, rented a car, and drove to the Hollow. She never made it. Her car was found parked along the roadside, doors locked, no signs of struggle. Her phone contained a single photo, the Hargrove house, still standing, but the house had been gone, hadn't it? That's when I knew the cycle wasn't broken. It had simply shifted. I returned on the 13th night of October. I brought with me everything I could carry. My father's flare gun, 2 canisters of fuel, a matchbook from the motel where I had first awoken. I stepped onto Dandelion Lane under a sky without stars. The town was still, not empty, just listening. The house stood exactly as I remembered it. Every board in place, every window dark. It greeted me like an old friend. I moved through it quickly, methodically. The parlor, the study, the staircase. I knew the path by heart. 13 steps down. The temperature dropped with every footfall. When I reached the chamber, the fire in my chest turned cold. Nothing had changed. The robes still hung. The book still hovered. The pit still breathed. And Thomas stood waiting. He didn't speak. He only opened his hand and offered me the ledger. This time I refused. Instead, I opened the first canister, doused the floor, and lit the first match. The fire spread faster than it should have. It roared with voices. The walls cried out. And in the last moment before I turned and ran, I saw Thomas smile, not in defeat, but in release. I emerged into the night coughing smoke. When I looked back, the house was gone, not burning, gone. In its place stood a single stone. On it, carved by no tool I recognized, was one word, remembered. Days later, news spread of the blaze, but there was no fire report, no ash, no incident logged by local authorities, only a rumor that a stranger had come to Dandelion Lane and vanished. The town closed its borders. The preservation committee dissolved. Clara Haythorne was found dead in the library with her mouth filled with soil. Harold Dunn's office was shuttered overnight. Everett Langley was never seen again. And I went home. If such a thing exists, after what I saw, sometimes I hear the chant again. Sometimes I wake with dirt beneath my fingernails. But I know this much. The house is gone, but the memory remains. And I carry it, because that was always the final ritual. Not sacrifice, continuation. In the weeks that followed the burning of the Hargrove house, silence did not return to Alders Hollow. Instead, something else settled in its place. Not peace, but consequence. The field where the house had once stood became a point of pilgrimage. People came quietly, without invitation, and without ever speaking of what they were looking for. They arrived at dusk and stood in a circle, as if waiting for a door that would never open again. But while the field remained empty, the rest of the world began to shift. At first it was small. A journalist disappeared after investigating sealed town records in Vermont. A library in northern England found that several books in its folklore section had pages rewritten overnight. A historian at a university in Eastern Europe released a report drawing direct parallels between a site known as the Chamber of 13 and the floor plans I had published from memory. She was dismissed from her post within the week. These were not coincidences. The pattern, once contained to a single house, had begun to echo outward, not physically, but through the very mechanism it relied on, memory. In cities far from Massachusetts, children began waking up in the middle of the night, whispering names their parents had never taught them. In isolated towns across the globe, teachers reported students drawing the eye enclosed in the triangle, though none could explain where they had seen it. In an old monastery buried in the Norwegian countryside, an archaeologist uncovered a room sealed with 13 iron bolts and a stone with the word "remembered" carved into it in a language no one had used for centuries. These events were not immediately linked. The world resisted connection. It preferred chaos, accidents, isolated myths. But slowly, researchers, independent, unconnected, began to talk. Academics who had previously dismissed folklore as harmless began to cross-reference symbols, timelines, even surnames. The name Thomas appeared in migration logs, in burial registries, in documents that predated the town of Alders Hollow by over 400 years. The fire had not destroyed the cycle. It had exposed it. What had been concealed by a community was now unraveling in public, and the systems built to ignore it began to fracture. Records long considered incomplete were reopened. Municipal libraries began digitizing archives once deemed too fragile to handle. Names that had been erased reappeared in margins, stamped in ink that had turned red over time. Historians from 3 continents independently concluded that settlements as far apart as southern Argentina, central Turkey, and rural Alaska had exhibited near-identical phenomena across a span of over 2 centuries. The phenomenon became known in whispered academic circles as the Hollow Pattern. Government agencies, pressured by public interest and internal whistleblowers, attempted to suppress it, but the internet had already consumed it. My documents, shared anonymously and replicated 1,000 times over, became part of a digital underground, hosted on servers in countries with no interest in censorship. The phrase "we remember what was buried" appeared on billboards, in graffiti, etched into subway tiles. The chant, once spoken only in the chamber beneath the house, was performed in performance art pieces, whispered in classrooms, sung in alleyways by children who did not know the meaning of the words. I watched it happen from a distance. I did not return to the field. Not then. I spent most of those months in silence, trying to understand what I had unleashed. I was not the hero of this story. I was not the destroyer of an evil. I had simply been chosen, and in my survival, I had become a vector. Some wrote to thank me, others begged me to stop, and a few, the ones who understood, simply asked, "What comes next?" Because the world was not just remembering, it was being remembered, and that was the danger. The finality of the ritual in Alders Hollow had not sealed the gate, but rather shifted it. The Hargrove house had served its purpose. It had trained the cycle to adapt. The memory, now no longer tethered to location or bloodline, had found a new host, us. I was approached in secret by a man who claimed to represent a coalition of archivists, linguists, and former intelligence agents. He told me there were other houses, not exact replicas, but echoes. Structures with similar foundations, sealed basements, family lines marked by patterns of silence and sudden fortune. He asked me to come with him, to verify, to help contain. I said no, because I knew the truth. There would be no containing this, not anymore. The idea had escaped. It had rooted itself in the mind of the world, and no wall, no fire, no government order could undo that. This was not a cult or a conspiracy. It was a memory long denied its voice, and now it was speaking through us. Months passed. Alders Hollow was officially dissolved as a township. The land was labeled unstable terrain by a geological survey that found no evidence of seismic activity, only a strange electromagnetic fluctuation that increased during new moons. Property records were voided. The houses were abandoned. Only the field remained, unclaimed, unfenced, and always surrounded by silence. I returned 1 year after the fire, not to cleanse, not to pray, but to remember. The grass was high, the flowers taller, their petals arranged in near-perfect spirals. I walked to the center, where the stone once stood. It was gone now. In its place was a hollow in the earth, no deeper than a footprint, and yet when I stepped into it, the world fell away. For a moment I was back in the chamber. The robes hung still, the book hovered, and the voice, not Thomas, not mine, spoke only once. "You are not the last." Then I was alone again, but I knew what it meant. The ritual would return, not in basements or catacombs, but in dreams, in stories, in symbols carved into playground benches and whispered between strangers on trains, not because it was summoned, but because it was ready. It has been 3 years since I left Alder's Hollow. The place no longer exists in maps or databases. It was absorbed, renamed, reclassified, the same way memory is softened over time, smoothed into something safer to hold. And yet, the weight of it remains, pressed behind my ribs like an echo that never quite fades. I live alone now, far from towns with churches older than a century, far from forests that grow in circles. I do not keep mirrors in the house. I unplug the clock every night before I sleep. And still, there are moments, brief, unprovoked, when I hear the floor creak beneath a footstep that is not mine, when I smell candle wax in the dark, when a wind passes through the trees and seems to chant in a tongue older than breath. They say time heals, but time, I've learned, does not heal memory. It preserves it, like salt over flesh. There are mornings I wake with the word remembered, carved into the condensation on the window pane. I wipe it away before it dries. I do not know if I wrote it in my sleep, or if something outside is trying to remind me that I was once the seal, that I still am. The world has changed, or maybe I just see it differently now. Children hum melodies they've never learned. Strangers cross themselves with gestures that predate Christianity. A teenager once passed me on the street and whispered a phrase I hadn't heard since the ritual. She did not stop walking. She did not look back. I often wonder how many of us there are now. Fragments of the hollow, walking vaults of memory. I don't think it matters. The gate didn't close. It expanded. What once required a house, a bloodline, and a ritual now needs only to be spoken aloud, even in jest. That's how memory works. It doesn't wait for permission, and it never forgets its shape. Sometimes I walk out into the field where it all ended. There is nothing there now but grass, and yet the wind always turns cold when I reach the center. I sit for hours, trying to hear the voices again, half hoping I never do. But on the worst nights, the ones when the memories knot themselves around my spine and I wake with the taste of ash in my mouth, I remember what Thomas told me. You are not the end. You are the bridge. That was never meant as comfort, and yet it is. Because if the memory chose me, it can choose others. If you're hearing this, truly hearing it, not just listening, then maybe it's already chosen you too. And if some part of you feels changed now, if your dreams stretch longer than they used to, if you've started counting steps without knowing why, then remember this: you are not alone, and the silence ends when we speak. So speak. Tell someone. Let the memory pass forward, not to haunt, but to warn. Because houses burn, names fade, but memory survives. If this story reached something in you, don't turn away from it. Hold it, carry it, pass it forward. Because that's how these truths live on, not buried beneath floorboards or sealed behind walls, but spoken, remembered, shared. That's how we keep the next door from opening. That's how we keep the 13th step from being taken again. And maybe, just maybe, that's how we stay free.